Okay, guys, last chapter, chapter 15, autonomic nervous system. Let's go to the next slide. Let me grab my drawing pen here real quick. Autonomic nervous system, these are motor neurons. These guys control the smooth muscle. They have an influence on the cardiac muscle, and they control glands. This is totally involuntary. That's what it autonomously. Um, Not under control of your conscious brain. This is independent. I always think of it as being like an automatics type of system. Here's a good table that gives us some of the differences between the autonomic and the somatic nervous system, such as the target organs. Um, let's see what we got here. Part of the PNS controls muscles within the body. Part of PNS, motor neurons, connects to, and skeletal, well, it's the same thing. Anyway, you guys can look through this. It's not that complicated. Okay, comparing the autonomic and the somatic nervous system. The somatic neurons are going to be heavily myelinated. You've got a single neuron that's going from the CNS, and we're talking about maybe the motor neuron. We've got a single motor neuron from the ventral horn of the spinal column that goes straight to the effector organ, which is usually one of the skeletal muscles. Now, for the autonomic nervous system, we're going to talk more about these neurotransmitters later, so I'm not going to talk too much about that right now. We have of course, we know we've got a two neuron chain from the CNS to the organs that these guys control. So there is an ANS neuron, lightly myelinated. This is preganglionic. This is the one that's coming from the CNS. And there's the ganglion, which in the sympathetic system is right next to the spinal cord, and in the parasympathetic much further off. These guys are going to synapse here, and then we have unmyelinated postganglionic axons going from this neuron. Now, for this guy, this is a special case. This is sympathetic neuron, by the way, guys. Same lightly myelinated. This guy goes to the adrenal gland, specifically to the middle part called the adrenal medulla. When he releases his neurotransmitter, it causes this guy to release massive quantities of epinephrine and norepinephrine. That's the trade names for epinephrine is adrenaline. Gives you an idea what's going on here. Parasympathetic, lightly myelinated, goes to a ganglion, which is much further. This is going to be very long in the parasympathetic. This is going to be very short in the sympathetic. And this is going to be short in the parasympathetic, and this is going to be long in the sympathetic. And again, it's going to be unmyelinated postganglionic axon. ANS is stimulatory. It's going to cause a muscle contraction. Now, in the PNS, the autonomic nervous system can be either stimulatory or inhibitory, depending on which one of these guys is, whether sympathetic or parasympathetic, and which organ. For example, the parasympathetic is going to increase the stimulatory in the GI tract, but it will be inhibitory in the heart. And if you guess that the sympathetic is going to be just the opposite, you would be right. Showing some area of overlap, this little Venn diagram showing how the somatic and the autonomic nervous system do share some characteristics. You guys can look at that. It's not that big of a deal. Parasympathetic, rest and digest. This is the guy that when you're chilled out, especially after eating a large meal, you quieten the body down, use the least amount of energy, and we spend all of our attention, so to speak, digesting food and getting rid of waste materials. That's a parasympathetic's job, rest and digest. Sympathetic, this is the guy that is the fight or flight system. This is the guy that's going to hype you up, get you all hyper when you're confronted with something that scares you or threatens you. Uh, you're walking along down your sidewalk and a big dog jumps out at you. All of a sudden, your heart beats faster, your breathing is faster. That's because your sympathetic system is getting you ready to either fight that dog or run from it. So, rest and digest. So, what do I expect to happen if I'm in fight or flight? I need to dilate my pupils. I need to open them up so that I can see better. I need to stop anything that's not necessary, uh, like digestion. So all of these things are going to go away. I'm going to increase my heart rate, make my heart beat faster. When it says relax airways, what it means is basically I'm going to relax the muscles so that the airways get larger. Stimulate release of glucose. Well, sure, the glucose is our fuel for our muscles, so we need that. Inhibit the gallbladder. Sure, that's part of the GI tract. Secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Oh, yeah, those are the guys that really hypes up your body. Relax the bladder. Now, this is something you're going to be talking about more in AMP2, reproductive. The the sympathetic actually is responsible for ejaculations and the vaginal contractions that help to bring the semen to the cervix. So, parasympathetic, I would expect basically the opposite. Constrict the pupils, because usually your vision is focused in a closer rather than further away. Stimulate saliva. We're all about GI tract now. Slow the heartbeat. Doesn't need to be fast. Constrict the airways. Get the stomach going. Stimulate the gallbladder and the intestines. Inhibit the release of glucose. We don't need to release glucose because we're in a rest and digest. Contract the bladder, which of course is going to eliminate urine. And the sympathetic is going to cause erection of the erectile tissues in the male and the female. Okay, the parasympathetic is also called the craniosacral division because the main fibers are leaving from the cranial and the sacral part of the spinal cord. The terminal ganglia lie close to or even inside the target organs. So this is going to be what our sympathetic, there's the preganglionic, there's that sympathetic chain, and there's the postganglionic. Here is the parasympathetic. I better mark these so you guys will remember. And there is his synapse, and there's the postganglionic. So that's structurally they're slightly different. So the parasympathetic is going to follow this pattern. So that's what they mean when they say the terminal ganglia. The ganglia, the next neuron, is going to be further away from the CNS. Okay. Preganglionic fibers, oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. Yes, those are all cranial nerves, but those cranial nerves, if you recall, have autonomic fibers with them. And then we get neurons that are in the the lateral gray matter, in other words, the lateral horn of the spine in the area of S2 to S4. So this is where the craniosacral comes from, guys. You can see this, guys. There's the ciliary ganglion going to the eye. Pterygopalatine. I can't read that. It's too small for me. Anyway, these are the postganglia. These are the terminal ganglia, and you can see cranial nerve 10 going straight there. The otic ganglion going to the ear, so forth, so forth. And cranial nerve 10, we've already talked about how these guys go everywhere. And these pelvic splanchnic nerves are going to go to like the bladder, the genitalia, the uterus, and the ureter. Sympathetic thoracolumbar. So in the thoracic and the lumbar region is where we're going to have. Now again, these guys are in a chain of ganglia that run on both sides of the spine. The sympathetic chain ganglia, one chain on each side of each vertebrae. And we've already talked about how these guys do. So these guys are going to run from T1 through L2. And I've already showed you the illustration, and you can see these. So these guys are going to leave the spinal cord, synapse very close, and then send out their very long axons to the organs that they innervate. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit. There's the rami communicants. We didn't talk about this when we were doing the PNS. I told you we would take care of it here, and here's where we do. So there's a lateral horn, a preganglionic neuron. This guy, you can see his axon go down here, and he is going to go, he's going to leave, this is the spinal nerve, right? He's going to leave the spinal nerve, and he's going through the white ramus communicantes. He's going to go there, and this is the sympathetic chain ganglia. So there's a neuron there that he's going to synapse with. That neuron that he synapses is going to go through the gray ramus and actually go back into the spinal cord. That's really all there is to it. Not too awfully difficult, guys, promise. But you do need to have that straight. This, after leaving the cord via the ventral rami, sympathetic fibers, white rami to the trunk, and now we're going to talk about the three possibilities, what these guys can do. Number one, just what we said, it can go back into the gray ramus and then just go out with the nerve, the spinal nerve. Go to wherever it's going, a blood vessel or sweat gland or whatever. This is synapsing at the same level, so I'm going out the white ramus, going to the ganglia, coming back in the gray ramus on the very same level. The reason I say that is because we can do it the other way. This guy can go out the white ramus and then go up and actually synapse not with this neuron but with this guy, and he can go out the the gray ramus right there. So he can synapse higher, or he could do it the one lower. The third possibility, this guy can actually go to a distant collateral ganglion, maybe in the abdomen or pelvis. So that's a possibility too, guys. There's our three pathways. Visceral reflexes. We talked about the somatic reflexes. The visceral reflexes are going to be very similar, except they're going to involve more neurons. Same components, the receptor, going through the sensory, the dorsal root ganglia, and this interneuron here is going to synapse with the lateral horn. This guy is going to go out through the spinal nerve, leave the white ramus, come into the gray ramus, or synapse there, and then enter back in the gray ramus. So basically, you just have two neurons in this one. Visceral reflexes, simple function, receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, and two visceral. So we got a total of 4 neurons involved. All visceral reflexes are polysynaptic. There's more than one synapse. What kind of reflexes? Gastric and intestinal reflexes, passing stool, urination, light reflexes, swallowing reflex, coughing reflex, baroreceptor reflex, and things having to do with reproduction. Sympathetic, those are all parasympathetic, by the way. Sympathetic reflex, cardial acceleratory, the vasomotor, pupillary reflex, and then the ejaculation. Okay. I think this is basically the same thing. They're just giving you a different comparison. So you see the somatic reflex. We talked about that, stepping on the nail. The ANS, unconscious, automatic, stereotype, just like the somatic is stereotype, because it's going to basically produce the exact same action every time. Visceral receptors instead of somatic sensory receptors. And we're going to actually get the effectors are going to be either cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. High blood pressure controlled by the baroreflex. When your blood pressure goes up, the nerves are going to send this to the medulla. The medulla is going to send a signal through the vagus nerve, and that vagus nerve is going to cause the heart to slow down. Parasympathetic, right? And that's going to reduce the rate, and that's going to decrease the blood pressure. Neurotransmitters. Told you we were going to talk about these. These are the guys, and I think we discussed this. These are the means by which two neurons communicate. I mean, they have their axons and their terminals and dendrites or whatever, but there's a gap there, and there's got to be a chemical that floats across that gap to bind to a receptor on the receiving neuron. That's all there are. These guys can be either inhibitory or excitatory. We did talk about that back in chapter 12. The excitatory are going to stimulate the brain, inhibitory going to calm. Duh. That's hardly worth saying. Remember, a receptor is something that's usually it's either on the surface, although it can be on the inside. And this guy has a specific shape, and it's going to bind a certain molecule, and when it binds that molecule, it's going to cause some action to take place inside the cell. Two neurotransmitters used by the autonomic nervous system. Acetylcholine. We talked about acetylcholine, choline, when we were talking about the muscles. And here's another one, norepinephrine. Isn't that the same stuff that the adrenal gland releases? Yes, it is. But we do use this as a neurotransmitter. So if they use acetylcholine, they're called cholinergic fibers. If they use norepinephrine, they're called adrenergic. Remember, this would be norepinephrine is also the same thing as noradrenaline. The transmitter, what it does can be excitatory, inhibitory, depends on what kind of receptor it's binding to. We've already talked about that. That's a repeat. Now, of the cholinergic receptors, the acetylcholine comes in two flavors. One of them is nicotinic, the other is muscarinic. Where are you going to find these guys? Well, the nicotinic, those are the type that we use on the skeletal muscle cells. All of the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic are going to use nicotinic. In other words, the receiving. So if this is neuron 1 in the chain, and he goes down and synapses with neuron 2, neuron 1 is going to use acetylcholine. Specifically, he's going to use the nicotinic version of acetylcholine. So this guy has a receptor for that. That is for all the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. So what am I trying to tell you? I'm trying to tell you that if you just remember the exceptions, this is not so hard. All postganglionic neurons of all types, sympathetic and parasympathetic, have receptors for nicotinic acetylcholine. Muscarinic receptors, these are going to be on, this is neuron number 2, and we're in the parasympathetic system. This is what's going to be used on the organs that the parasympathetic controls. It's going to be muscarinic acetylcholine. Nicotinic is always stimulatory. Muscarinic can be stimulatory or inhibitory depending. There is one other sympathetic postganglionic on the eccrine sweat glands. The sympathetic nervous system controls that, and it's going to use muscarinic acetylcholine. Adrenergic, so these guys come in two classes. There's the alpha and the beta. These guys can be excitatory or inhibitory as well. I think I lost my drawing pencil there, guys. Let me grab it. Okay. So alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. Ignore this stuff, guys, because this doesn't really pertain to what we're doing. What I want you to see, though, is I'm showing you these guys. So parasympathetic, nicotinic receptors. So this is acetylcholine, nicotinic, because that's the ganglion. So the preganglionic neuron uses nicotinic acetylcholine. The postganglionic neuron uses acetylcholine too, but he uses muscarinic. These are going to be things such as the SA and AV node of the brain, or the heart rather, the smooth muscle in the GI tract, the bronchioles, the passageways, and the eye muscles. Okay, sympathetic, scratch these guys out so we can not focus on them. Scratch this guy out so we don't focus. Sympathetic, nicotinic acetylcholine is used by the preganglionic neuron. So this guy's got a receptor. Postganglionic neuron is going to use norepinephrine, alpha or beta type. Now the exception is on this sympathetic neuron, these are the guys that go to the sweat glands. They use muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. So for the sympathetic, blood vessels, cardiac, SA, that's the pacemaker of the heart. The exocrine glands, eye muscles. And of course our motor neuron uses nicotinic acetylcholine to control the skeletal muscles. Also notice that you see here that you've got this very long axon on the preganglionic I don't know how I can do this, preganglionic, and very short on the postganglionic. And we see just the opposite what I told you before. Nicotinic, muscarinic, we've talked about the adrenergic. Here's dividing up the alpha and the beta in the subtypes. So we know this is going to be most of the postganglionic sympathetic neurons are going to use norepinephrine. The beta 1 is predominantly heart, kidney, and adipose. And you can read over here and see this. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. I'm just trying to show you how to read it. The beta 2, lungs and other target organs, blood vessels, beta 3, adipose tissue, which causes these guys to do lipolysis, in other words, break down fats to produce energy. The alpha receptors constricts the blood vessels, the visceral organ sphincters, dilates your pupils. Alpha 2 inhibits norepinephrine from the adrenergic terminals, inhibits insulin by the pancreas, and is pro-blood clotting. Sympathetic division is solely in blood pressure. We talked about when we did the peripheral nervous system that most organs have both sympathetic and parasympathetic, like the heart. The sympathetic nervous system will speed up your heart. The parasympathetic will slow it down. The heart actually sets its own pace. It doesn't need the nerves to move, not like your skeletal muscles. But there are some things which only have one system, and the blood pressure is only sympathetic. So the sympathetic neurons control the size of your blood vessels. If your blood vessels are small with the same amount of blood, it's going to be higher pressure than if you opened it up. But how do you do that? The sympathetic are going to constrict this, but to dilate, you simply back off on the amount of sympathetic innervation. That's got a name. It's called vasomotor tone or sympathetic tone, because there's always going to be a partial constriction. If there wasn't, then you would go into shock. You'd have a catastrophic drop in blood pressure that you might not be able to recover from. You would probably die. Parasympathetic fibers are actually going to be the dominant fiber in the heart. The sympathetic is there and he can take over, but to give you an example, our normal pacemaker and our hearts beat at 100 beats per minute, but our heart hardly ever beats that fast unless we're actually exercising. That's because parasympathetic tone, the parasympathetic is going to tone down the heart. And then, of course, the smooth muscles, GI and urinary tracts. Sympathetics can override the parasympathetics in times of crisis. Fight or flight. Okay, here's something else that happens. Not only does the sympathetic going to shut down the GI tract, but he's also going to shunt the blood away from the GI tract and send it to the muscles. We have to give priority to our skeletal muscles and heart while we're in a life-threatening situation. Digesting our happy meal can wait till later. But when we're in a resting or we're postprandial, that is after a meal, then we will shunt the blood away from the muscles and to the GI tract, because we need the blood to transport the nutrients to the liver. Okay, guys. The ones that are only have sympathetic are innervation, the adrenal medulla, because all it does is release epinephrine. The eccrine sweat glands are only under sympathetic control. The erector pili muscles, the guys that give you goosebumps, are only under sympathetic control. The kidneys Kidneys have a lot to do with blood pressure, and the blood vessels we've already talked about. Sympathetic division is going to control our sweating, so it can open up the blood vessels in the skin when it's hot out, which helps us to dump the heat from our core to the periphery. The sweat glands are going to be stimulated to sweat, and we do just the opposite when the temperature goes down. If it's January, then we shunt the blood away from the skin and we restrain our sweating. And as I told you, the kidneys have a lot to do with blood pressure. One thing, and we're not going to talk about it, this is an A&P2 topic, is renin. Renin from the kidneys will increase your blood pressure. So sympathetic system has a lot to do with the release of renin from the kidneys. Metabolic effects. If you're in a fight or flight, you raise your metabolic rate of all your body cells, you raise your blood sugar, you start breaking down fats for fuel. I mean, you're in a life-threatening situation. At least that's what it was originally intended for. Although other stressful situations can bring it on too. Localized versus diffuse. The parasympathetic innervation is fairly short term, and it is very localized to very specific areas. Acetylcholine, I think we mentioned this in muscle chapter. Acetylcholine esterase breaks it down. The sympathetic division, much longer lasting, and it is body wide. If you're digesting your dinner, you only need your GI system involved. If a big dog or a tiger, saber-toothed tiger is chasing you, you need your entire body in the loop. Norepinephrine is inactivated more slowly than the acetylcholine, which is part of its longer lasting. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are from the adrenal medulla is also going to prolong this effect. Hypothalamus, we talked about that. This is the main control center for the ANS. The subconscious input from the limbic system, emotions, go to the hypothalamus, which is why when you're scared or when you're nervous, that emotion causes you to sweat. Don't sweat it. That old saying, it's because you will sweat when you're nervous, because the sympathetic system is controlled by the hypothalamus, and the emotions via the limbic systems are input there as well, which is a survival thing. If you're afraid, then probably something is threatening your life, and so you need to get that guy in. There's obviously the cerebral cortex and spinal cord and other structures are involved as well. The controls can either be direct or indirect, and indirect is going to be through that reticular system. The hypothalamus we've already talked about had control centers for the heart and blood pressure, for your body temperature, for your water balance, for various endocrine activities. And again, rage, pleasure, and the biological drives all will activate your autonomic nervous system. Reactions to fear, we've already talked about that one too. Okay. Limbic system, the emotional input, frontal lobe, it's a two-way street for these guys communicating. Hypothalamus is overall is the manager of the ANS. Brain stemmed with a reticular formation. Remember all those centers we talked about there. And then the spinal reflexes too. Cortical controls, connections, the hypothalamus and with the limbic area allow the cortex to have an influence on the ANS. Voluntary cortical control of visceral activities is possible. That's that biofeedback. You can control your heart rate consciously. You can control your autonomic nervous system with practice because your conscious mind can override the hypothalamus. Because remember, this guy may be the manager of the ANS, but this guy's the CEO. CEO outranks a manager, okay? Awareness of physiological conditions, we've already talked about it. Biofeedback, they use that sometimes for stress and migraines. That was really popular in the 1970s. Haven't heard a lot about it. Guys, that is the end of chapter 15, and that is the end of Anatomy and Physiology 1. You are now officially done. Well, after you take your exam anyway.